Chapter 1. The Vanishing. Sarah Mercer had a theory about autumn. Not the kind of theory that could be published or defended at a university, but the kind that accumulated in your bones if you paid attention long enough. Autumn was when routines broke. People rushed, trying to complete summer plans before winter arrived, or escape them. In October, contradictions surfaced. People who had been careful became careless. People who had been patient ran out of time. Sarah had been on the Asheville PD for 7 years, and she had learned to read the seasons the way other people read weather reports. It was October 6th, 1982, when the call came. 2:15 in the morning. A child missing since the previous evening, about 15 hours unaccounted for. The dispatcher's voice was controlled, practiced, the voice of someone who had already decided what this case was. A 5-year-old with hearing and speech impairments, a remote cottage, an extensive search by volunteers that had turned up nothing. The subtext was clear: lost child, likely perished, tragic, but ultimately an act of nature. Sarah had listened to that voice 100 times. What interested her was not what the dispatcher said, but the rhythm of the saying, the space between phrases, the small delay before the word disappeared. That hesitation meant something. It always did. But it might mean many things, and Sarah had learned not to decide which until she had more information. She'd been 3 hours on the road when she saw the mountains rise in front of her like a wall. The Blue Ridge Parkway cut through them at angles that didn't make intuitive sense. Every turn seemed to lead in the wrong direction, and yet somehow you arrived at your destination. Sarah had learned to trust roads like this. They were built by people who understood that the shortest distance between 2 points wasn't always the most obvious one. The Webb cottage appeared through the trees around 5:45 a.m. It was the kind of place that looked different depending on the light, charming in afternoon sun, isolating in early morning fog. There were 3 police cars in the drive and a handful of volunteer trucks. Inside, Sarah could see movement. A family that hadn't slept, or a family that was pretending they hadn't slept. Sarah had learned the difference. Helen Webb was sitting at the kitchen table with her hands wrapped around a coffee mug that had gone cold hours ago. She didn't drink from it. She simply held it, as if the warmth, or the memory of warmth, was necessary. This was the first thing Sarah noticed. Not tears, not agitation. Helen's daughter-in-law, Margaret, was making sandwiches that nobody would eat. Thomas Webb was pacing near the window, but Helen sat still, waiting. "Mrs. Webb," Sarah said, pulling out the chair across from her. "I'm Detective Mercer. I'm going to ask you some questions, and I want you to take your time answering them. There's no rush." Helen's eyes moved toward Sarah like something surfacing. "Of course," she said. Her voice was steady, too steady. But Sarah had learned that steadiness didn't necessarily mean deception. Sometimes it meant control. Sometimes control meant guilt. Sometimes it meant something else entirely. "Tell me about Marcus," Sarah said. "He's 5. He doesn't hear well. He has a congenital hearing loss. He doesn't speak much, but he's observant. He notices details that other children miss." "What kind of details?" "Colors, how light falls, patterns in objects. He can sit for an hour arranging things by size or hue. David and Christopher get bored, but Marcus finds it calming." Sarah made a note, not of the words themselves, but of the precision in Helen's description. It was the description of a mother, yes, but it was also the description of someone explaining a problem, someone distancing herself from the explanation by using the language of observation rather than affection. "Is he a happy child?" Sarah asked. Helen hesitated, not a long hesitation, but long enough. "Most of the time, yes. He has his moments of frustration, when the world doesn't cooperate with his expectations. But mostly, yes, he's content. Content. Not joyful, not loved. Content. Like a pet. like an object that had been properly calibrated. "Walk me through yesterday," Sarah said. "Start from when you arrived at the cottage." Helen set the mug down carefully. "We drove up on Sunday afternoon. Thomas met us here from Charlotte. The boys were excited. It was a mild day. We had lunch around 1 o'clock, sandwiches and soup. After lunch, I cleared the table and started preparing dinner. Thomas was working in his study. The boys were playing in the living room, and Marcus went upstairs to the boys' bedroom." "Was Marcus sent upstairs, or did he choose to go?" Helen's jaw moved slightly. "He chose to. He likes to be alone sometimes. He processes things better that way." "And you went outside?" "Around 4:45. We needed firewood. I went to the stack we keep at the property line, collected what we needed, and brought it back inside. I was gone maybe 20 minutes. "Maybe?" Sarah asked. "Yes. I didn't check the time precisely, but around 20 minutes. "How would you describe the weather at that time?" "It was getting cool, overcast. The sun was starting to set. So it would have been getting dark, or starting to get darker." "Yes." "And when you came back inside, what did you do?" "I set the firewood down in the kitchen and went upstairs to check on Marcus. I wanted to tell him we were having dinner soon. When I opened the bedroom door, he wasn't there." "How did that make you feel?" Sarah asked. The question seemed simple, but it wasn't. The answer would tell her whether Helen was concerned or relieved. "Frightened," Helen said. "Initially I thought he might be in the bathroom, or hiding. He sometimes hides when he doesn't want to interact. So I checked the bathroom, then the other bedrooms. Then I came downstairs and checked everywhere on the ground floor." "How long did this search take?" "Maybe 10 minutes. Then I called Thomas out of his study, and we searched together. We called for Marcus outside. We checked the shed and the garage. That's when I realized something was seriously wrong." Sarah nodded and made a note. Helen's narrative was clean, logical, internally consistent, which meant either it was true or it had been carefully constructed. Sarah couldn't yet tell which. "What about your older sons? Where were David and Christopher during all of this?" "In the living room. They were playing with their toys. David came to help us search after I told them Marcus was missing." "And David didn't hear anything? Didn't see anything unusual?" "No. He said the television was on. They were watching a program. He didn't notice that Marcus had left." Sarah made another note. The television was on. That was convenient. A noise that would mask the sound of a door opening or a child calling for help. But it was also the kind of convenient detail that a mother would naturally mention. Kids watched television. Noise happened. This was ordinary. Sarah spent the next hour exploring the cottage and the surrounding area. The back porch opened to a small yard that faced the woods. From here, a person could see perhaps 50 yards before the trees became too dense to penetrate. The ground was soft with pine needles, and the air smelled like earth and decay and the approaching winter. The backyard showed signs of recent activity, footprints in the soft earth, multiple sets, overlapping. The volunteer search parties had been through here, but Sarah also noticed something else. Near the back porch, in the mud, there was a single small footprint, child-sized. The edges were relatively clear, not degraded, suggesting it was recent. Sarah photographed it mentally. The footprint could mean many things. It could mean Marcus had gone out the back door, or it could mean David or Christopher had been outside, or it could mean nothing at all. When Sarah returned to the kitchen, Thomas Webb was waiting for her. He was tall, with the kind of shoulders that suggested he spent his life in offices rather than in nature. His face had the particular arrangement of features that people practiced, concerned but composed, helpful but not over-invested. He had clearly decided on his role in this narrative. "Detective," he said, "I want to help however I can. I know the search teams are out there, but I feel like I should be doing something." "Tell me about Marcus," Sarah said. "What's his relationship with Scout?" Thomas seemed surprised by the question. They're close. Scout follows him around like she understands that he moves through the world differently. When Marcus gets frustrated or overwhelmed, Scout seems to calm him down. How long have you had Scout? About 3 months. We brought her home from a breeder in Raleigh. The boys wanted a dog, and we thought Scout would be good for Marcus especially. She has a calm temperament. Did Marcus ever take Scout with him when he wandered away from the house? Not that I'm aware of. Scout generally stays with the family, but if Marcus goes outside, Scout will follow him. She won't let him out of her sight. Sarah nodded. This matched what Helen had said, but it also meant that Scout's disappearance wasn't necessarily coincidental. If Marcus had left the house, Scout would have followed naturally. Or if someone had taken Marcus, Scout might have followed them. Either way, the two disappearances might not be connected. Then again, they might be. David and Christopher appeared later, 2 boys who clearly understood that adults made decisions, and children lived with the consequences. David was 12, and had the careful manner of a child who had learned early to observe and follow instructions. Christopher was 10, and still retained some of the openness of childhood, though even he was learning to be cautious. "Tell me about yesterday afternoon," Sarah said, speaking to both of them, but watching David. "About when Marcus was playing upstairs." "He was arranging things," David said. "He does that sometimes. He was very focused." "What was he arranging?" "Stones, I think. He collects them sometimes, and organizes them by color." "Did he seem happy? Upset? Anything unusual?" "No. He seemed normal, the way he usually is when he's organizing things." "Did you hear anything from upstairs? Any sounds that seemed unusual?" David and Christopher exchanged a glance, quick, barely perceptible. Not eye contact, more like a synchronized moment of decision. Then David spoke. "There was the door opening. I heard the back door open downstairs. Mom went outside for the firewood. And then? And then we watched television. I think it was maybe 15 or 20 minutes later when Mum came back in." "Did you hear the door close when she came back in?" Maybe. I'm not sure. The television was on. And after your mother came back in, did you hear anything from upstairs? Any indication that Marcus had moved? Any sound at all?" "No," David said. "Nothing. But then Mom came and told us that Marcus was missing, so we went to look for him." Sarah nodded. The timeline was consistent with what Helen had said, but it was also consistent with many other possibilities. David's certainty about what he had heard, and his uncertainty about what he hadn't heard, was exactly the kind of response that you got from a 12-year-old who had been through a shock. Or it was the kind of response you got from a 12-year-old who knew more than he was saying. Sarah found the boys' bedroom upstairs on the eastern side of the cottage. It was a bright room with 2 beds, a desk, and a dresser. And toys were arranged on shelves with careful precision, books organized by height, action figures lined up in formation, building blocks sorted by color and size. On the floor, someone had arranged small stones in a deliberate pattern, blues in one line, reds in another, yellows and whites separate. The arrangement was recent. No dust had accumulated on the stones since they'd been placed. Sarah knelt beside them and studied the pattern. It spoke of patience, of a mind that found comfort in order. This was what Marcus had been doing when he disappeared, building a world of perfect categorization. On the window seat, Sarah found a drawing. It was crude, the work of a young child, but intentional. It showed a tall figure with arms raised, a dog beneath the figure, lines that might have been a road or might have been anything, a house in the corner, small and distant. Sarah studied the drawing without touching it. The figure was drawn larger than typical proportion, but children always drew people larger than objects. It was normal. The arms were raised, but that could mean many things: joy, surrender, reaching for something, calling out. The dog was positioned under the figure, connected by a line that might have been a leash or might have been nothing. It was a 5-year-old's drawing. It could be interpreted 100 different ways, and none of those interpretations would be reliable. Sarah photographed the image in her mind and moved on. Eleanor Blackwell lived 2 properties over, down a road that curved through thickening forest. She was 83 and lived alone in a house that had belonged to her family for 60 years. She offered Sarah tea and spoke with the confidence of someone whose mortality had been negotiated with and settled. "I saw the dog," Eleanor said, "around 4:30 on the 5th. It was walking down the road toward my house, very purposeful, like it had somewhere specific to go." "Walking alone?" Sarah asked. "Yes, the dog was alone. It passed by my mailbox, looked at me, I was on the porch, and then turned around and went back the way it came. I remember being surprised because usually Scout stays close to the property, but this was different, like the dog was testing something." "Testing something," Sarah repeated. "What do you mean?" Eleanor paused. "I mean, the dog seemed to be making a decision. It wasn't wandering aimlessly. It was moving with a specific purpose." Sarah made a note. Eleanor was observant, but she was also interpreting animal behavior through human understanding. Dogs didn't test things, but they did respond to signals. If someone had called Scout, or if Scout had smelled something, the dog might have moved with apparent purpose. "Did you see anyone with the dog?" Sarah asked. "No, I was alone on the porch." "And you mentioned a car?" "Yes, about 20 minutes later. A blue sedan. I remembered because there's not much traffic out here. Usually just the mailman, and occasionally someone lost." Sarah waited. Eleanor seemed to have more to say. "Virginia plates," Eleanor continued. "I remember thinking someone was lost because the windows were too tinted. You don't see that much on these back roads. And I heard music, very faint, coming from the car. Classical music. Sounded like Mozart or something similar." "Did you see the driver?" "No, but I saw it was heading south, away from the Webb property." "And you're certain about the music?" "I've been listening to classical music for 40 years, Detective. You develop an ear for these things." Sarah made a note. A blue sedan with Virginia plates, tinted windows, classical music. It was specific enough to be memorable, general enough to be nearly impossible to trace. Either Eleanor had noticed these details because they were unusual, or she had constructed these details because she had decided in advance what would be unusual. "Did you tell anyone about the car?" Sarah asked. "I mentioned it to Sheriff Holloway when the search started, but he didn't seem particularly interested. He was already focused on searching the woods." The search continued through the afternoon and into the evening. Volunteers from the nearby town of Asheville moved through the forest in organized patterns, calling Marcus's name at regular intervals. Sarah observed them from a distance, noting how they moved, how they searched. Most of them didn't expect to find a living child. That was evident in their pace, their tone of voice, the way their eyes scanned the ground rather than the trees. Raymond Corbett was among the volunteers. He was a handyman who had done work on the cottage, winterization, roof repair, electrical upgrades. He moved through the forest with the ease of someone who knew it, or who wanted people to think he knew it. He called Marcus's name periodically, but Sarah noticed that his heart didn't seem to be in it. He was going through the motions, or perhaps he simply didn't believe they would find a living child. Sarah watched Raymond carefully. There was nothing overtly suspicious about him, nothing that suggested anything beyond what he claimed to be, a local working man who was participating in a community search. But Sarah had learned that the absence of suspicion could be as significant as its presence. Around 6:15 p.m., one of the volunteer searchers came out of the woods on the northern side of the property. He was calling for the other searchers, his voice carrying an edge of urgency. Sarah moved toward him and found him standing beside Raymond, who was holding Scout. The puppy was muddy and exhausted, but otherwise unharmed. More importantly, Scout had reappeared almost exactly 24 hours after disappearing. Sarah understood immediately what this might mean. Dogs didn't sustain themselves well in the wilderness. A puppy especially. They got tired. They came home. Or they were taken somewhere and released with the expectation that they would find their way back. Or perhaps the dog had simply wandered away and now found her way back. Sarah couldn't yet tell which. Helen made a sound when she saw Scout. Not quite a scream, but close to it. Relief and something else. Something that Sarah catalogued and stored away. Sarah knelt beside the puppy and examined her with careful hands. Scout's coat was matted with mud, her tongue was swollen, and caught between her teeth was a scrap of fabric. Navy blue, child-sized. Sarah extracted it carefully and held it up to the light. The scrap was about the size of a quarter, frayed at the edges, as if torn rather than cut. It was the kind of fabric that a 5-year-old might wear, the kind that would catch on something, a branch, a fence, a hand, if a child were engaged with something, or moving through something. But it could also have been caught on something else entirely, or on something Scout had simply encountered in her wandering. Sarah looked at the fabric in her palm. It was small. It was almost nothing, and it could mean almost anything. She looked at Helen, whose relief had already begun to settle into something more complicated. She looked at Thomas, who was watching the fabric with an expression that Sarah couldn't quite read, concern, or something that was performed as concern. She looked at Eleanor Blackwell, standing at the edge of the gathering, her face carefully neutral. She looked at Raymond Corbett, who had already stepped back into the crowd of volunteers, making himself unremarkable. And Sarah understood that the story she'd been told was one version of events, that there were other versions waiting beneath it, that something had happened, but she didn't yet know what, that there was intention here somewhere, but she couldn't yet see its shape clearly. She only knew that a 5-year-old boy was still missing, that a dog had returned home on schedule, and that someone, or perhaps many people, knew more than they were saying. The question wasn't whether this was intentional. Sarah wasn't yet certain enough to ask that question. The question was simpler and more troubling. The question was, what had actually happened? Chapter 2. The Witness. Dr. Michael Chen was a veterinarian who had made an unusual career choice. While other veterinarians spent their days treating pets and livestock, Chen had found himself pulled toward forensic work, examining animals that had been involved in crimes, reading their bodies for stories they couldn't tell. His clinic on the outskirts of Asheville was modest, the walls lined with certificates and journals that few people ever bothered to read. Scout lay on the metal examination table, with her paws extended, her breathing shallow. Sarah sat in the corner, watching. It was 10 a.m. on October 7th, and Sarah had been awake for 32 hours. She didn't feel the exhaustion yet, but she knew it was coming. "She's dehydrated," Dr. Chen said, running his fingers along Scout's spine. "Significantly. The mucous membranes inside her mouth are dry, and her body weight is lower than it should be for a 6-month-old golden retriever of this size." "How long would she have been without water?" Sarah asked. "That's difficult to determine precisely, but based on the degree of dehydration, I would estimate at least 20 to 30 hours, possibly longer." Sarah made a note. 20 to 30 hours. Scout had disappeared on October 5th in the afternoon. She had reappeared on October 6th in the late evening. The timeline fit. "What about food?" Sarah asked. "There's no evidence of recent feeding. Her stomach is relatively empty. She has some vegetation matter. Grass, probably. But nothing else. A puppy this size would normally show signs of having eaten something in the last 12 hours or so." "Doctor." Chen placed his hands on Scout's abdomen and began to gently palpate. His expression didn't change, but Sarah watched his hands slow, noticed the slight pause. "What?" Sarah asked. "Nothing definitive," Dr. Chen said, "but I'm noticing some minor abdominal distension. Not severe, but present. It could indicate stress or anxiety, possibly both. Can you determine how long she was confined? Confined to what? A room? A crate? A vehicle? Unknown, Sarah said. That's what I'm trying to establish. Dr. Chen examined Scout's paws more carefully. He was looking for something specific, and Sarah waited without speaking. When he finally looked up, his expression was more measured than before. There are fibers caught in her paw pads, he said, consistent across all 4 paws. The fibers appear to be woven material, possibly rope, possibly fabric, but the distribution pattern suggests she was standing on or pressing against something made of this material for an extended period. Could it be a leash? A leash typically contacts only the neck area. This is different. The fibers are on her paws, which suggests she was either walking on the material repeatedly, or, he paused, or she was struggling against a surface made of it. Sarah understood the implication, without Dr. Chen stating it directly. A puppy, struggling against something, or struggling to get free from something. I'm going to send samples for analysis, Dr. Chen continued, but based on what I'm seeing, I can tell you that this animal has been through some form of distress. Whether that's being lost in the woods or something else, I can't say with certainty. Sarah nodded and made another note. Dr. Chen was being careful to stay within the boundaries of what he could actually determine. She appreciated that. Too many experts made pronouncements as if they were interpreting tea leaves. Chen was describing evidence, not building narratives. Sarah left the clinic and drove directly to the Asheville police station. She needed to speak with Sheriff Holloway about the tire tracks, but more than that, she needed access to the records. Missing children cases usually had patterns, and patterns told stories. Holloway was in his office, reviewing search reports. He looked up when Sarah entered, and she could see the exhaustion on his face. This was his county. These were his people. The pressure was visible in the set of his shoulders. "The dog," Holloway said. "What did the vet tell you?" "That she was dehydrated and showed signs of distress. That she hasn't eaten in at least 12 hours, possibly longer. And that there are fibers in her paw pads consistent with prolonged contact with woven material." Holloway set down his papers. "Meaning what?" "Meaning I'm not certain, but it suggests Scout was confined somewhere. Not in the woods. Somewhere else." Holloway stood and walked to the window. His office had a view of the mountains, the same mountains that dominated the landscape around the Webb cottage. "We found something else," he said. "During this morning's search, about 2 miles south of the cottage. An old campsite. Someone had been there recently. There was a fire pit with fresh ash and some discarded food packaging. We're processing it, but it's not pristine. Other people use these areas." "How far is it from the tire tracks you found?" Sarah asked. "Quarter mile, maybe, in the same general direction." Sarah felt something shift in her thinking. An old campsite, a tire track, a dog that had been confined and then released. These weren't random observations. They were points on a map. They were suggesting a route, a geography, a plan. "I need to ask you about something else," Sarah said. "Vehicle thefts in this area, in the last 6 months. Any patterns?" Holloway looked at her. He seemed to be deciding whether to answer. Finally, he moved to a filing cabinet and pulled out several folders. 3 vehicles stolen from the Asheville area," he said. 1 in August, 2 in September. All recovered within a few days in rural areas south of here. 2 were SUVs, 1 was a truck. All returned to their owners with minimal damage. Sarah examined the reports. The pattern was exactly what she'd seen in the broader search she'd been planning to conduct. 3 vehicles, all stolen during business hours, all from residential areas, all recovered in rural locations. "Were there any charges?" Sarah asked. "No. The vehicles were recovered undamaged, and the owners didn't want to pursue. In a small town, you get vehicle theft. People borrow cars to get somewhere and abandon them. It happens." "Or," Sarah said slowly, "someone borrows vehicles specifically to get somewhere without using their own car. Somewhere they don't want traced directly to them." Holloway didn't respond immediately. He was beginning to understand the same things Sarah was understanding. "You think someone planned this?" he said. "Took a vehicle, drove to a remote location, did something, and then left the vehicle to be found." "I think it's possible," Sarah said, "which means I need to know who stole those vehicles, or who had access to them, or who was seen near them." "That's going to take time," Holloway said. "These cases are weeks old." "Then we'll need to work quickly," Sarah said, "because if I'm right, Marcus Webb isn't just missing. He's been taken to a remote location and held there, and whoever did it has done this before." Sarah spent the next 2 hours at the police station, reviewing case files. The vehicle theft reports yielded little useful information. No witnesses, no clear suspects, no evidence beyond the theft and abandonment itself. But the pattern held. All 3 vehicles had been taken from owners who lived on the outskirts of town. All 3 had been recovered in areas that were accessible by vehicle, but isolated from main roads. Sarah asked Holloway for a map of the county and marked the locations: the tire tracks near the Webb cottage, the abandoned campsite, the recovery locations of the stolen vehicles. When she stepped back, the pattern was visible. A line moving south and east, away from the town center, into increasingly remote areas. "What are you seeing?" Holloway asked. "A geography," Sarah said. "Someone who knows the area. Someone who has identified remote locations that are accessible but hidden. Someone who has tested the response time, stolen vehicles to see if they get caught, held them for short periods, then abandoned them." "You're saying someone was practicing," Holloway said. The realization seemed to sit heavily on him. "I'm saying someone may have been preparing, testing how easy it would be to take something, or someone, to a remote location and keep them there without being found." Sarah returned to the Webb cottage late in the afternoon. The house had taken on a particular kind of stillness. The volunteer searchers had largely moved on. Thomas and Helen were inside with the boys. The television was still on in the living room, a cartoon playing to an empty room. Sarah found Helen in the kitchen, preparing dinner, the routine of domestic life persisting despite the crisis. Sarah had seen this before. Sometimes grief and shock manifested as paralysis. Sometimes it manifested as an obsessive return to normalcy. "Mrs. Webb," Sarah said, "I have some additional questions." Helen set down the knife she'd been using and turned to face Sarah. Her expression was difficult to read. Tired, yes, but something else underneath. Resignation, perhaps, or readiness. "I've been thinking about what you asked yesterday," Helen said, before Sarah could speak. "About people Marcus trusts." "Yes," Sarah said. "There are several people who have spent time with him. Eleanor Blackwell, she lives nearby. She gives him candy and lets him organize her belongings. He likes that routine. And then there's Raymond Corbett. He did work on the house. He's patient with Marcus. Doesn't treat him like there's something wrong with him." Sarah made a note. "Anyone else?" "His brothers, of course. My husband. Me. That's really it. Marcus doesn't warm up to people easily. When he does, it's usually because they've been around consistently." "What would Marcus do if someone he trusted suggested going somewhere with him, taking a walk or an adventure?" Helen's hands stopped moving. She was holding a potato, and she was looking at it as if it might contain an answer. "Depending on how it was framed," Helen said quietly, "Marcus might go. If it was presented as part of his routine, collecting rocks or organizing something, he might trust it enough to go along. But only if it seemed safe, only if it fit his understanding of how the world works. So someone would need to understand Marcus," Sarah said. "Really understand him, know what would make sense to him, what would feel safe." "Yes," Helen said. "Someone would need to know Marcus the way I know him, or very close to that." Sarah waited. There was more coming. "That's what frightens me most," Helen continued. "Not that Marcus was taken by someone violent, but that he was taken by someone he trusted, Someone who understood how his mind works well enough to manipulate that understanding. Sarah watched Helen's face. There was genuine fear there, but there was also something else, something that looked like guilt. "Has there been anyone new in Marcus's life recently?" Sarah asked. "Anyone who wasn't there before?" "No," Helen said. "Just the people I mentioned. Everyone else is familiar, people he's known for months or years." "And Raymond Corbett? How long has he been working for you?" "About 8 months, on and off, winterizing the house, fixing the roof, electrical work. He's reliable, competent, good with the boys. 8 months, long enough to establish a pattern of visits, long enough to understand Marcus's routines, long enough to plan." Sarah was about to ask another question when she heard Thomas come downstairs. He appeared in the kitchen doorway and took in the scene, his wife and a detective in quiet conversation. His expression shifted. "Is something wrong?" he asked. The question was directed at Sarah, but his eyes were on Helen. "I'm asking some follow-up questions," Sarah said, "about people who have spent time with Marcus, people he trusts." "Of course," Thomas said, but he wasn't meeting anyone's eyes. He was looking at his hands. "Mr. Webb," Sarah said, "I need to ask you where you were on October 5th between 4:45 and 7 p.m. Thomas looked up. "I was here, working in my study. I didn't know Marcus was missing until Helen told me." "Did you hear anything unusual? Any sounds from outside? Any indication that something was happening?" "No, nothing." "And you didn't leave the study during that time?" "No, I was working." It was a clean answer. Too clean. The kind of answer that was prepared for. The kind of answer that indicated he had already thought about what he would say. Sarah made a note and stood. She needed to leave the cottage before her instincts became too obvious, before Thomas and Helen understood that she was no longer simply investigating a missing child. She was investigating them. "I'll be in touch," Sarah said. "If you think of anything else, please call." Sarah drove back to town as the sun was setting. The light turned the mountains purple, then grey. The road curved through the forest, and Sarah thought about geography, about how physical space shaped possibility, about how someone who knew this landscape could use it, could hide in it, move through it, disappear into it. She thought about a dog confined without food or water. She thought about a child who understood the world through patterns and routine. She thought about someone carefully planning an abduction, testing the boundaries, understanding exactly what would happen next. And she thought about Helen's hands, stopping mid-motion, as if frozen in the act of preparing dinner for a family that might never be whole again. Sarah didn't yet know who had taken Marcus Webb, but she was beginning to understand that the person who had taken him wasn't a stranger. It was someone close enough to understand him, someone capable enough to plan carefully, someone who was still walking free, still pretending, still performing the role of the concerned family member or local handyman, someone who was waiting to see if Sarah would figure it out before it was too late. Chapter 3. What Remains. The Blackwell house was older than the others in the area, built in the 1920s, with the kind of architecture that suggested permanence. Eleanor Blackwell had lived here for 63 years. Her husband had died in 1975. Her children had moved away and rarely called. The house had become less a home and more a museum of memory. Sarah sat in Eleanor's living room on the morning of October 8th, surrounded by books arranged in perfect order. Eleanor had offered tea, which Sarah had accepted, but not drunk. They were discussing Marcus. "He would come here sometimes," Eleanor said. "With his mother usually, but occasionally alone. He likes to organize things. My books are organized by subject, then by publication date, then by author. Marcus would spend hours rearranging them. It was very focused behavior, very intentional." "Did he ever seem unhappy when he visited?" Sarah asked. "No, quite the opposite. He seemed content, more than content actually. When Marcus was organizing my books, He was completely present. His brothers are restless. They want to be outside or playing with toys. But Marcus finds something in the act of ordering, something that calms him. Sarah made a note. And you would give him candy? Yes. He likes lemon drops particularly. I keep them in a bowl. He would organize the books and eat lemon drops. It was a routine we developed. Who else knew about this routine? Eleanor paused. She was a woman who thought carefully before speaking, and this pause suggested she was considering what to say and what to withhold. My neighbors knew. Thomas and Helen certainly knew. Raymond Corbett, because he did work here as well. He would see Marcus organizing the books when he was here doing repairs. Sarah felt something shift. Raymond Corbett had access to Eleanor's house. Raymond Corbett knew about Marcus's routine. Raymond Corbett knew that Marcus came here regularly and that he responded to the structure of organizing objects. Tell me about Raymond, Sarah said, beyond the handyman work. Eleanor set down her tea carefully. He's a local man, does work for several families in the area, good with his hands, reliable usually, but there's something about him I've never quite trusted. What do you mean? He watches people, more than is necessary. He remembers details about their lives, not in a kind way, but in a acquisitive way, like he's collecting information about them, building files internally. Sarah made another note. Acquisitive, not curious, but acquisitive. Has he ever done anything that specifically concerned you? There was an incident about a year ago. He was doing work at one of the summer cottages nearby, the Hargrove property. The owners reported items missing after he finished. Money mostly, small amounts, nothing that would have held up in court, but enough that they questioned him. Did they press charges? No, they simply didn't hire him again. But you did, Sarah said. It wasn't a question. I did. I needed the roof repaired, and he was the most affordable option, and nothing went missing from my house. Nothing that Eleanor knew of, Sarah thought. When was he here most recently? October 4th. He worked on the roof most of the afternoon. He left around 5 p.m., I think. The day before Marcus disappeared. Sarah left Eleanor's house and drove to Sheriff Holloway's office. She needed to move quickly. The feeling was beginning to crystallize, not certainty yet, but the shape of it was becoming visible. I need everything on Raymond Corbett, Sarah told Holloway. Criminal record, known associates, financial records, everything. Holloway began making phone calls. What emerged was a picture of relative invisibility. Raymond Corbett, age 41, had never been convicted of a crime. He had no known associates. He had minimal financial history. His income was all cash, unreported to the tax authority. He existed in the system only as a name on a driver's license and on utility bills for his apartment. It was the profile of someone who understood how to exist without creating a trail. I'm going to search his apartment, Sarah said, and his vehicle. You have a warrant? Holloway asked. I will in an hour, Sarah said. I have probable cause based on the theft at the Hargrove property and opportunity at the Webb residence. In reality, she had suspicion and pattern, but not yet proof. But sometimes suspicion needed to move faster than the legal system allowed, as long as you were careful. Raymond's apartment was even more austere than Sarah had remembered. One bedroom, a small kitchen, a living area that contained nothing personal. But in the closet of the bedroom, Sarah found something that changed everything. Military surplus canvas, a roll of it, perhaps 6 feet long, and beside it, coils of rope, cordage in multiple thicknesses, some showing signs of wear. Sarah photographed everything before touching it. She didn't need to search further. The tent, the enclosure that Scout had struggled against, had been constructed from this canvas. The fibers that had lodged in Scout's paws were from this specific weave. We're going to get forensics out here, Sarah told Holloway, and we're going to match these fibers to Scout. This is enough for an arrest, Holloway said. It's enough for questioning, Sarah corrected. It's not enough to prove he took Marcus, and it's not enough to prove where Marcus is. Raymond was brought in for questioning at 4:15 p.m. on October 8th. Sarah sat across from him in the interview room, with Holloway present. Raymond's expression was calm, almost neutral. He had clearly prepared for this possibility. "We found military surplus canvas in your apartment," Sarah said. "And rope. Can you explain why you have these items?" "I use them for work," Raymond said. "Tarps, coverings, securing materials. It's standard equipment for someone in my line of work." "Have you ever constructed a tent from this canvas?" "No, I don't camp." Sarah leaned forward. "We also have physical evidence that Scout, the Webb family's puppy, was confined in an enclosure made from this type of material. The fibers match, Raymond. Scout's paws have fibers embedded in them that are consistent with your specific brand and weave of canvas." Raymond didn't respond immediately. He was thinking, calculating. Sarah watched his face carefully. "I don't know how the dog got those fibers," he said finally, "but I didn't take Marcus Webb. Where were you on October 5th between 4:45 p.m. and 7 p.m.? "Working on Eleanor's roof until around 5 p.m. Then I drove home. Anyone see you?" "Not that I recall." "Raymond," Sarah said quietly, "I know you didn't do this alone. I know someone else is involved. Someone with access to remote properties. Someone with resources. Who is it?" Raymond's jaw tightened. He had been prepared to lie about the canvas. He had been prepared to deny the abduction. But this question about the other person, had struck something. "I want a lawyer," he said. Sarah left the interview room and sat with Holloway in the observation area. Through the glass, she could see Raymond sitting motionless, waiting. "We don't have enough," Holloway said. "We have fibers, we have canvas, we have opportunity. But without a confession or a body, we don't have Marcus." "We have him," Sarah said. "We just have to find him." Her phone rang. It was Dr. Chen. "I've been analyzing the fibers more closely," he said. "I ran them through a database of textile manufacturers. The military surplus canvas you're talking about, it's specific. There are only 3 retailers in North Carolina who sell this exact weave. But more importantly, I found something else." "What?" "I analyzed the stomach contents from Scout more carefully. Beyond the grass and the dehydration, there were trace amounts of something else. Particulates that are consistent with soil from this region, but specifically from areas with high iron oxide content. Red clay, basically. There are specific locations in the Asheville area where you find that type of soil." "Can you narrow it down?" "Not precisely, but I can give you coordinates for the 3 areas where this soil type is most concentrated." Sarah took the coordinates and looked at them on a map with Holloway. 2 of the locations were relatively accessible. The third was in a remote area about 8 miles south of the Webb cottage, in an area that was technically public land, but was rarely visited. "That's too remote," Holloway said. "No roads. You'd have to hike in." "Which means it's exactly where someone would hide," Sarah said. "If they knew the terrain, if they had prepared the location in advance." She was thinking about the tire tracks, about the pattern of stolen vehicles and remote locations, about Raymond's calendar with its markers of work days, about the camping equipment, the rope, the meticulous organization. Someone had planned this carefully. Someone had tested the response. Someone had identified a location and prepared it. And someone had known exactly how long Scout could survive without water, and when to release her so that she would arrive home with enough strength to return and provide evidence that would lead exactly where it was supposed to lead. Or had it? Sarah's mind was moving through the possibilities, because if Scout was meant to be evidence, then someone had wanted Sarah to find her. Someone had wanted Sarah to understand that Marcus had been confined. Someone had wanted Sarah to be led down a particular path. But why? Unless this wasn't about kidnapping Marcus for ransom. Unless this was about something else entirely. Unless this was about discrediting the Webb family. destroying the family from the inside, creating a situation in which Thomas and Helen would have no choice but to cooperate. Sarah picked up the phone and called the Webb cottage. "I need to speak with Thomas," she said when Helen answered. "He's not here," Helen said. "He went out an hour ago. He said he needed to clear his head. He was very agitated." Sarah felt her blood go cold. "Did he say where he was going?" "No, just that he needed to think." "Sarah, what's happening? What have you found?" Sarah hung up without answering and turned to Holloway. "Get officers out to those locations marked by Dr. Chen, now, and put out an APB on Thomas Webb. I think he's running." The call came in 45 minutes later. A hiker had found Thomas Webb wandering in the remote area south of the cottage, near the coordinates Dr. Chen had provided. Thomas was alive. He was confused, and he was leading officers to a location that had been hidden beneath camouflage netting, a large military-style tent, partially buried in a ravine. Inside the tent, they found evidence: the canvas walls, the rope restraints, water bottles scattered across the floor, and the particular smell of confinement, of human waste, of fear. But they didn't find Marcus. Thomas's first words when Sarah arrived were, "Where is he? Where's my son?" And in that moment, Sarah understood that Thomas had no idea where Marcus was, which meant Thomas had never known, which meant Thomas had been manipulated just as thoroughly as his family, which meant the real orchestrator of this crime was still out there, still in control, still holding the last piece of the puzzle. And that piece was the location of a 5-year-old boy who had been missing for 3 days. Chapter 4. Reckoning. The hospital in Asheville had a particular smell, antiseptic, and something underneath it, something like fear. Sarah sat in the waiting room on the morning of October 9th, drinking coffee that had gone cold hours ago. Beside her was Holloway. Across from them was Thomas Webb, who hadn't spoken in 8 hours. The officers had found Marcus in a secondary location, not in the tent where Thomas had been waiting, but in a small shed approximately 1 mile further south, buried in a ravine and concealed beneath branches and dirt. The boy had been there for 3 days. He was dehydrated, malnourished, and traumatized, but he was alive. The fact that he was alive was almost the only thing that kept Sarah from seeing this as a complete catastrophe. A doctor emerged from the back rooms and approached the group. His name was Dr. Reeves, and he had spent the last 6 hours examining Marcus for injuries. "He's stable," Dr. Reeves said. "Physically, he'll recover with time. He's severely dehydrated, and he's lost some weight, but there's no evidence of serious harm. He was given water and some food while he was confined. His captor clearly understood that a dead child wouldn't serve his purposes." Thomas made a sound, not quite a sob, not quite a scream, something between those states that had no name. "Psychologically," Dr. Reeves continued, "that will take longer. But children are resilient. He may not even remember most of this. Trauma at this age is sometimes erased by the mind's own mercy." Sarah didn't believe in that kind of mercy. She had seen what trauma did to children. It didn't disappear. It transformed into something else: anxiety, disconnection, a particular way of moving through the world that suggested you expected betrayal at every moment. "Can we see him?" Thomas asked. "Not yet," Dr. Reeves said. "We're running some additional tests, and he's sleeping now. The medication we gave him is helping, but in a few hours, yes." When Dr. Reeves left, Thomas stood and walked to the window. He stood there for a long time without speaking. Helen joined him, and they stood together in a silence that suggested they had nothing left to say to each other. Not yet. Perhaps not for a very long time. Sarah left the hospital and drove directly to the police station. She had been waiting for something, waiting for a call, waiting for evidence, waiting for the pieces to arrange themselves into a shape that made sense. During the drive, she reviewed what she knew: the tent, the canvas, Scout's fibers, the calendar with its markers. Raymond had been specific about dates and locations, but vague about motivation. He kept saying, "I was hired," without explaining who had hired him, or why. She sat with Holloway in his office and reviewed the timeline she had constructed. From Eleanor's observation to David's involvement took about an hour of questioning. "Once I understood what I was looking for," Sarah told him. "Once I understood that a child could be convinced that kidnapping was justice, the rest followed logically. The question was, who convinced him? Because David didn't think this up on his own." "Mrs. Morrison," Holloway said. "Yes, but I needed to understand how she had access to David." That's when Eleanor's observation about seeing them together in the woods became crucial, and then it was just careful questioning. David wanted to explain himself. He wanted to justify what he'd done. Once children start justifying, they provide details. Raymond Corbett was brought in for questioning again at 3 p.m. on October 9th. This time, Sarah led the interview. "I know who hired you," Sarah said, not bothering with preamble. "Catherine Morrison, the mother of a child who contracted leukemia from industrial contamination. Contamination that Thomas Webb's company deliberately concealed." Raymond didn't respond immediately. He was recalculating, understanding that his silence now was less protective than it had been before. "Tell me how she approached you," Sarah continued. "She came to my apartment about 3 months ago," Raymond said quietly. "She had researched me. She knew about the thefts I'd been suspected of at the Hargrove property. She knew I needed money. She knew I had skills she could use." "And she told you what she wanted?" "She told me about her son, about his illness, about how the company that caused it had never been held accountable. She told me about Thomas Webb specifically, how he had made a choice, a conscious choice, to cover it up. She said that Thomas needed to understand what it felt like to have something precious taken from you. And you agreed? She paid me $20,000 to build a structure and to ensure a child's confinement. She said the child would be returned after the police stopped searching. She said this was justice." Sarah leaned forward. "Did you believe that?" "No," Raymond said. "But I needed the money, and she was persuasive. She talked about her son constantly, about how unfair it was, about how nobody was ever held accountable for what happened to him. After a while, I stopped thinking of it as kidnapping and started thinking of it as, I don't know, adjustment. That's what criminals tell themselves," Sarah said. "That their crimes are justified, that the people harmed deserve it, that the world will be better because of what they've done. But the world doesn't work that way, Raymond. Actions have consequences beyond what we intend." The investigation into Catherine Morrison's identity took another day. Sarah and Holloway traced her connection to the shopping complex development, to her son Jack Morrison's medical records, to the environmental contamination reports that Thomas Webb's company had deliberately buried. The facts were clear. Jack Morrison, age 11, had been diagnosed with acute lymphoblastic leukemia. The leukemia likely resulted from prolonged exposure to industrial toxins during construction at the shopping complex, where his mother worked as a site safety coordinator. Thomas Webb had voted to conceal the contamination, and Catherine Morrison had spent 3 years planning to make Thomas Webb understand what she understood, that sometimes the system of justice failed, and people had to create their own. But the missing piece was David. Eleanor Blackwell provided the answer when Sarah visited her for the 3rd time. "I saw them together," Eleanor said, "David and Mrs. Morrison, about a month before Marcus disappeared. They were in the woods behind my property, walking very deliberately. Not like they were simply walking, like they were planning something. I didn't think much of it at the time, but thinking back on it now." "They were strategizing," Sarah finished. "David knew." "I believe so, yes. David and Mrs. Morrison had met through some kind of community service program. David volunteered at the hospital where Jack was being treated. He knew Jack. He knew how sick Jack had been. And Mrs. Morrison, she can be quite persuasive when she's talking about justice." Sarah found David Webb at his school during lunch period. She brought him to a quiet office and closed the door. "David," Sarah said, "I need to ask you some questions about October 5th. "I already told you about October 5th, David said. "We were watching television. Mom went outside to get firewood. Marcus disappeared." "That's true," Sarah said. "But what I didn't ask you is whether you knew Marcus was going to disappear." The moment stretched. Sarah watched David's face carefully. She was looking for the moment when he decided the game was ending. "I can't talk about that," David said finally. "You can," Sarah said gently. "You can, and you need to. Because if you don't, I have to assume you were a willing participant in a kidnapping. And if you were willing, that means you're complicit in a crime. But if you were convinced by someone, if someone made you believe that this was just, that this was necessary, then we can understand how you arrived at that decision." David's hands were gripping the edge of the table. "She said Dad deserved to understand," David said quietly. "She said that Jack almost died because of what Dad did, that Jack will spend the rest of his life wondering if the cancer is coming back. She said that was a kind of death too, and she said that Dad needed to understand what that felt like, that Dad needed to know what it was like to have his son taken from him." "And you believed that?" Sarah asked. "I wanted to believe it," David said. "I wanted there to be justice for Jack. I wanted my father to understand what he'd done. Did you know that Marcus would be scared? That he would be traumatized?" David's face crumpled. "I didn't. I thought he would just be somewhere else for a while. I thought Scout would be with him, and he would be okay. I didn't understand that he would be trapped, that he would be afraid." "No," Sarah said, "you didn't understand. Because you're 12 years old, and you don't have the experience to understand how confinement feels to a 5-year-old. And because Mrs. Morrison didn't tell you the full truth. She wanted you to believe it was just. She needed your cooperation to make the plan work." Catherine Morrison was arrested at her home on October 10th. She didn't resist. When Sarah placed her under arrest, Catherine simply nodded, as if this was an expected denouement to a play she had already written. In her home, Sarah found detailed records, photographs of Jack throughout his illness, medical bills, corporate documents from the shopping complex, letters that Catherine had written to Thomas Webb, begging for compensation, begging for acknowledgement, begging for something resembling justice, all of them unanswered. And there was a journal, page after page of Catherine's reasoning, how the system had failed her family, how corporations were allowed to poison children and walk away, how Thomas Webb had made a choice, a conscious choice, and had never been held accountable, how she had decided that she would create accountability, how she would make Thomas Webb understand what she understood every single day, that sometimes the people you love are taken from you and nothing restores them. It was the journal of someone who had lost hope in the system, but not in justice itself. The distinction was important. "Why did you involve David?" Sarah asked during the interrogation. "Because I needed him to understand," Catherine said. "Because David is Thomas's son, and he needed to see that his father's choices had consequences. Because David was old enough to comprehend justice, even if he was too young to understand its full implications." "You manipulated him," Sarah said. "I educated him," Catherine replied. "I showed him a truth that his own father wouldn't acknowledge. I showed him that sometimes the people we're supposed to trust fail us, that sometimes we have to create justice ourselves." "And Marcus?" Sarah asked. "What did you teach him?" Catherine's expression didn't change, but Sarah saw something shift in her eyes. The moment when Catherine allowed herself to consider what she had done from Marcus's perspective. "I ensured his safety," Catherine said. "I ensured he would be returned unharmed. That was the only justice I could offer him." Raymond Corbett received a sentence of 8 years for conspiracy to commit kidnapping and false imprisonment. During sentencing, He spoke about being manipulated, about needing money, about not fully understanding what he was participating in until it was too late. The judge was not sympathetic. She sentenced him to the full term, noting that ignorance was not the same as innocence. Catherine Morrison received 15 years for kidnapping, conspiracy, and false imprisonment. She showed no remorse during sentencing. She looked at Thomas Webb, who sat in the courtroom throughout her trial, and said, "Jack will spend the rest of his life wondering if the cancer is coming back. That's the burden your choices created. I wanted you to understand that burden. I still believe that was justice." David Webb did not face criminal charges. He was a minor who had been manipulated by an adult. The district attorney determined that he had been a victim of Catherine Morrison's persuasion, even if he had also been complicit in the crime. David received mandatory counseling and probation. He was also removed from his home temporarily and placed with his grandmother while his parents pursued family therapy. 2 weeks after Catherine Morrison's arrest, Sarah visited the Webb cottage for the last time. Thomas answered the door. He looked diminished, as if the events of the past week had stripped away something fundamental. "Detective," he said, "come in." Helen was in the kitchen. She looked exhausted in a way that suggested sleep was no longer a reliable refuge. Marcus was in the living room with his brothers, watching television. The ordinary tableau of family life performed despite everything. "How is Marcus?" Sarah asked. "Recovering," Helen said. "Dr. Reeves says the physical healing will be complete within weeks. The psychological, that will take longer." "And David?" Thomas and Helen exchanged a glance. It contained anger and love and guilt and the complicated mixture of emotions that parents felt when their children made terrible choices. "He's processing," Thomas said. "He understands what he did was wrong, but he also understands why he did it. That makes it harder, I think. If he could just hate himself for being stupid, it would be simpler. But he had moral reasoning, even if it was twisted. He believed he was doing something right." "He was a child who was manipulated by an adult," Sarah said. "Yes," Thomas said, "but he was also a child who chose to participate. That distinction matters." Sarah didn't argue. She understood that Thomas needed to hold David accountable, even as he tried to forgive him. That was the particular burden of being a parent. "I wanted to tell you something," Thomas said, "about my company, about what we did." "You don't have to," Sarah said. "I want to," Thomas said. "I've contacted the EPA. I've provided them with all the documents from that time. I've cooperated with their investigation, and I've set up a fund for Jack Morrison, for his medical care and for his future needs. It won't undo anything. It won't make Catherine Morrison's choices right or wrong, but it's something." Sarah nodded. Justice remained incomplete and complicated, but Thomas had taken a step toward accountability. Sarah visited Marcus in the hospital one more time before the family was discharged. The boy was sitting up in bed, eating crackers and drinking apple juice. He didn't remember much of the confinement. The mind's mercy, working exactly as Dr. Reeves had predicted. But occasionally something would trigger a memory, a particular sound, a particular smell, and Marcus would go very still, his eyes fixed on something invisible. Helen sat beside him, reading a book. She looked at Sarah with a gratitude that Sarah wasn't sure she deserved. "Thank you," Helen said, "for finding him, for bringing him home." Sarah nodded, but she wasn't sure she deserved the gratitude. She had solved the case, yes, but solving the case didn't mean justice had been served. It meant that the system had functioned as designed, the perpetrators had been caught and punished. But the underlying injustice, the contamination that had poisoned a child, the corporate negligence that had never been held accountable until now, remained a scar on the landscape. "How is David?" Sarah asked. "He's struggling," Helen said. "He's trying to understand how he could have been so wrong about something that seemed so right. But he's also learning that morality is more complicated than he thought, that sometimes the people we believe are creating justice are actually creating cruelty, that the two can look very similar from a distance. Sarah looked at Marcus, who was still eating crackers with the focused intensity that was his particular way of engaging with the world. "I wanted to ask you something," Helen said. "Do you think Catherine Morrison was right? About the justice part, I mean. Setting aside the crime, was she seeking justice?" Sarah considered this carefully. "I think she was seeking to make your husband understand something that the system had failed to make him understand. I think she was trying to create accountability. But I don't think kidnapping a 5-year-old is justice. I think it's an extension of the original injustice. It's saying that your child's suffering justifies your victimizing my child, and I don't believe that equation works." "Neither do I," Helen said, "but I understand why she believed it." And that, Sarah thought, was perhaps the most important understanding. Not that Catherine Morrison was right or wrong, but that Catherine Morrison had arrived at her beliefs through a logical progression of justified anger, which meant that the system had failed her, which meant that there was a larger justice question that remained unresolved. Sarah returned to her office and found a package on her desk. Inside was a drawing. Marcus's drawing, the one from his bedroom in the cottage, the one that showed a tall figure with arms raised, a dog beneath the figure, a road disappearing into trees, a house in the corner, small and distant. There was a note attached, in Helen's handwriting. "Marcus wanted you to have this. He doesn't remember drawing it, but you looked at it, and you understood something about him, about how he sees the world. I wanted you to have something that showed you understood." Sarah studied the drawing. The figure was large and imposing. The dog was positioned beneath it. The road led away into distance. The house was small and isolated. It could have been a premonition of what was to come, or it could have been simply the random configurations of a 5-year-old's mind, seeing the world through his particular lens of colors and patterns. Sarah hung the drawing on the wall of her office, beside her desk, where she could see it every day. The case was closed. Marcus was alive. The perpetrators were in custody. Justice, whatever that meant, had been pursued through the legal system. But as Sarah looked at the drawing, she understood something that had been bothering her since Catherine Morrison's trial. The question wasn't, did Catherine Morrison seek justice? The question was, what had failed so completely that a mother felt compelled to create her own justice? And that was a question that would outlive this case by years, because it suggested that somewhere in the system, in the corporate structures that allowed contamination, in the legal system that failed to hold them accountable, in the broader society that accepted this kind of negligence as normal, there was a failure so fundamental that it had driven a grieving mother to believe that kidnapping was redemption. Scout, the golden retriever who had returned home with evidence caught between her teeth, had been returned to the Webb family. The dog moved through the house with the particular trauma of an animal that had experienced confinement but lacked the human capacity to process it rationally. David sometimes sat with Scout and apologized, and the dog, with the particular forgiveness that animals possessed, accepted these apologies without judgment. Life continued, not unchanged, not unmarked, but continued. And Sarah Mercer, detective, sat at her desk and looked at Marcus's drawing and understood that some questions didn't have clean answers. Some mysteries remained, even after the criminal was caught. Because the real mystery wasn't who done it. It was, how did we get to a place where this seemed like justice? And the answer to that question suggested failures that extended far beyond the boundaries of this single case.